Hello, everyone. This is lesson 36, lecture 1, where we are picking up the story of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE. One of the themes that we have observed about the 2nd century is that it is a good, peaceful century for much of the time, which includes the rule of the so-called 5 good emperors, whom, as you can read in Mary Beard, Gibbon observed this was like the best time for Rome. And we already in the last class have talked about a number of them. So we talked first of all about Nerva, under whom this principle of adoption is introduced. As you recall from the words of Pliny the Younger, the idea here is to find the best person for the job rather than a person who is technically an heir to the current emperor. So it's a sort of meritocratic notion, right? So it's not a dynasty, but instead it's let's find the best person. And the Romans, in fact, succeed in pulling this off 5 times in a row, insofar as Nerva is followed by Trajan, who we saw in the last lesson really excelled in terms of his military expansion into the empire and sort of really that idea of military success that Rome was famous for. And then we have 3 more emperors in this series: Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and then Marcus Aurelius, who for a period of time co-ruled with his cousin Lucius Verus. And it will be, in fact, Marcus Aurelius, the first of these men, who actually will have a son who not only is born, but grows up and reaches adulthood. And at the time of his death in 180, Marcus Aurelius' son will be able to take power, ending this series of the 5 good emperors. And as luck would have it, he will turn out to be a terrible emperor. And so, which gives all the more reasons for historians at already in the ancient world, but also today, to think about the 5 and the principle of adoption as a sort of unique period in itself, in which things were sort of peaceful in Rome and everything was relatively successful, but no direct inheritance from a father to son occurred. And I think one good way of thinking about the period between emperors 3, 4, 5 in that set, from Hadrian to Marcus, is that if we said that under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent, immediately upon his death, the Romans had to give up quite a bit of Trajan's final eastern conquest, so there will not be a province of Mesopotamia or something like that. But then sort of figuring out the empire within its current limits is what the second 3 emperors will do a sort of great job of. So if you look on the map, here is Mesopotamia, which is impossible to sustain. But these boundaries, Arabia, they will be able to keep, and so is Dacia also will remain. But so this is sort of the map of the Roman Empire, and it will not get bigger after this time. The other thing that's interesting about this map is that it shows us a number of places in North Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, various places where the Roman Empire had fortified boundaries. And so this is something that we can observe under Trajan's heir, Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138. And for now, in terms of looking at his image, I just want you to observe the facial hair situation in the 2nd century, which is that after Trajan, quite a few of the emperors will have a beard. And of course, that could be just a matter of fashion, but I think it will have more significance as we are to discuss later on in this lesson. But in terms of the empire's expansion, what's really interesting here is that in Britain, which is one of these areas where we are reaching limits, right, that the empire will not go to a natural border such as a river or an ocean or sea, we will see that under Hadrian, starting in 122, there will be a wall built. We are here in Britain, it's a tiny map, but this is what it looks like, right? This is not a grand wall. This is not the Great Wall of China. This is not very clear what exactly the function is. And Mary Beard goes into a very nice discussion about how this is not a great thing in terms of monitoring traffic. It's not a great thing in terms of keeping people out. But as she puts it here on page 485, what the wall asserts, what it asserts is Roman power over the landscape, while also hinting at a sense of ending. It may be no coincidence that other rather less dramatic walls, banks, and fortifications were developed in other frontier zones at roughly the same period, as if to suggest that the boundaries of Roman power were beginning to take a more physical form. And so I think this is not, these walls are not a measure of weakness, but what they do show is this sort of, okay, this is the end of the empire here. This is how far we go. It is very powerful. It shows a lot of manpower hours right here, right, to build all this wall all across Britain. Incidentally, it's interesting for us to observe that Hadrian's heir, Antoninus Pius, will expand the area and move the wall forward further north, expanding the direct control over Roman territory, suggesting, that they were somehow using these walls, because otherwise you would not put in that much effort to build another one to show off. But so these kind of borders, just as we see here in Britain, those two places, in Germany, again in Pannonia and Dacia, and in the other areas, will really give us a sense of these fortified frontiers. And I think one of the good ways of sort of also thinking about this sense of the empire as a whole, and how Rome is coming to terms with its own limits to expansion, is sort of to ask, well, what unites all of this territory? What makes us Romans? And so the question then becomes, what kind of Romanization is happening? And I think Romanization in this sense would mean something like people are learning Latin, which is true for much of the western part of the empire. In the East, Greek is the main language, and pretty much the expectation is that you should have some capacity to use those languages if you live in those parts, even though you, of course, might have a very different first language, right? There are many, many languages spoken, but Greek and Latin become sort of the key languages. So there is a sense of political and legal Romanization. Everybody sort of has to get used to a Roman system of law, which is thriving in the second century of the empire. But I think also there is a cultural and linguistic sense of this Romanization, insofar as culturally, this is a period of great boom. And rather interestingly, not only will this Romanization lead for the Romans to come to terms with Greek culture, but in fact, it will lead to a boom of Greek culture. And so we are talking about Hadrian. And in Hadrian's case, this sort of two sense, that Romanization that also includes some Hellenization, is really interesting to observe. And the way I like to talk about this is by talking about Hadrian's sort of partners. And one of those partners is his wife, who is depicted, Sabina, who is depicted here very beautifully. She is very chaste, clearly wearing a lot of clothes. Look how even her elbow is covered, her hair is sort of pulled back. And in addition to that, though, Hadrian also has a very famous boy lover by the name of Antinous. And rather shockingly, if we are traveling around in second century Roman Empire, one of the figures most often depicted is Antinous, the boy lover, who is this really gorgeous young man. And we see all these pictures showing off, his six pack and chest and whatnot. And what it also gives us a sense of this boy lover being so heavily portrayed, that imperial power at this point doesn't just mean you know, that you have the access to the most soldiers, or that you can kill whomever you want, but this sense that you have maybe the most gorgeous partner, you know, and that this is clearly a romantic relationship. And the idea is, and that's why this old-fashioned phrase of boy lover is used here, is that of course Hadrian is the man in the relationship, but that he has sort of this really gorgeous younger man as a romantic partner, also has a very Greek flavor to it, insofar as it's sort of that's how they understand it. So there is a little bit of a dynamic here between the Greek boy lover and the rather modest sort of Latin wife. And in addition to that, Hadrian also builds in Italy some structures. Well, he first of all travels around much of his empire, and you can see on the handout all the details about just how much he travels. But he, in fact, not only builds for himself a mausoleum in Rome, but he also builds himself a beautiful, very Hellenized villa in Tivoli, in Italy, which is sort of close enough to Rome so he can go there, but it's far enough so he can sort of escape there. And it gives us this sense of really the full embracing of the good life, right, of the 2nd century, of this idea that I can have a nice villa where I can hang out and have a good life, and I don't necessarily just need to exercise my power and to show that I'm powerful. I could just be the guy with the most beautiful villa and the most beautiful boyfriend, and that shows that I have the power, right? It's a different take on power. It's not about asserting through military and violent means. One other important building that gets rebuilt in this period is probably something that you may have seen if you have ever considered visiting the city of Rome, and that is the Pantheon, which of course is a temple to all the gods, right? Pan means all, theon means God. So this is a temple that actually was already in function, and as the sign here says, you can probably make out the name of Marcus Agrippa, but this gets sort of rebuilt under Hadrian in very significant ways, even though they will sort of have this pretense of, oh, we are just rebuilding it just because it hasn't been in good shape, and we kind of just, this is Agrippa's building. But I think this idea of embracing sort of all the gods is another sense that we get of this sort of living within the limits of the empire now and embracing all that we are. The next emperor after Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, also you can see here in the heroic nude, is one more example of this kind of Hellenistic aspect, even though unlike Hadrian, he never left Italy during his rule, but you can still observe the beard suggesting sort of his own sense as a sort of educated person. Maybe one other association is also a little bit of philosophically minded person is also in the beard. And so Mary Beard talks about how sort of Greek writing is really booming under his rule, this as a continuation of Hadrian's rule. And so this is what she has to say. Greek writing of the empire ranges from elaborate praise of Roman rule to obvious exercises in denial. In 144, for example, Aelius Aristides, who Mary Beard says is better known as a hypochondriac who wrote several volumes on his illnesses, true, and he survived too, delivered his speech in honor of Rome in front of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. It may have gone down well on the day, but it now makes a fairly sickening read, even for those used to probing between the lines of panegyric. Rome has surpassed all previous empires, bringing peace and prosperity to the whole world. Notice that message, peace and prosperity, right? This is not a message of war. May all the gods and their children be called upon to grant that the empire and the city itself flourish forever and do not come to an end until stones float on the sea. So this idea that, it also embracing all these gods, and that this will just sort of hopefully flourish in eternity is the sense of this long, successful, peaceful, and prosperous second century. Now, I just wanted to show one more image here from the rule of Antoninus Pius, who builds for himself actually on the Roman Forum a temple that will eventually worship him and his wife, shown here also very veiled up. Both of them are becoming gods, and on the back of this winged figure, who art historians debate exactly what the best name for, they fly off to the heavens as they become divine upon their death. This is the apotheosis, giving us an idea of sort of the sense of the good empire and how all these emperors, of course, are divinized and considered excellent. So the last of the set is Marcus Aurelius, who with Lucius Verus rules the Roman Empire starting in 161. And for now, maybe the main message I want to give about him is that, of course, again, the beards, right? But also that Marcus Aurelius returns a little bit more to the fighting imagery than Hadrian and Antoninus Pius. In addition to Trajan, Marcus Aurelius will have a column, a victory column in Rome, and some other imagery. For example, you can observe, this is from an art of his, there he is, the emperor sitting on a horse, and all these people whom he has overcome are begging him. And the main fighting that he has to do is, if we are looking, so this is the Roman Empire in brown on the bottom here, and this is an image of Europe, the Quadi and the Marcomanni, right? These are the two peoples that he mostly fights again. And just to give you a sense of, in terms of the variety of sort of religious phenomena in this period, one of my sort of favorite incidents of this time is that in the year 172, and this is actually depicted on Marcus's column, there is a time when the Romans are in a military conflict, in a battle, as they are fighting against the Quadi, and they very unusually for the Romans run out of water. And so they are getting very, very parched, and everything is looking really bad. Then all of a sudden, apparently miraculously, the rain starts falling, and you know, they're all saved by the bell. Now, the really exciting question is not the rain itself, but sort of how do you get the rain, right? This is some kind of miraculous event. And I don't know what you would want to call this winged monster-like figure here, but that would be sort of the equivalent of some kind of divine figure that brings the rain. But given that this is the year 172, one of the things that we get is that different religious groups now are claiming this miracle for themselves. Some people suggest that it was the Egyptian gods, maybe Isis, maybe somehow by magical means. The Christian sources later on, of course, claim that it was Christian soldiers praying to the Christian god, that's why it rained. And of course, the emperor himself will issue an image suggesting, which also goes a little bit along with the Egyptian god explanation, is that it was the piety and wondrous power of the emperor that brought the rain. But all in all, it gives us the sense of this very culturally rich and culturally somewhat diverse empire, in which you know, these 5 good emperors have ruled, and which is in many ways the last good times in the Roman Empire, because with Marcus's son Commodus coming into power in the year 180, he is the first son to inherit, is the end of the good era. And as the historian who writes about a generation after Commodus says, this is the end where the Roman Empire will change from a kingdom of gold to one of rust and iron. And so this is part of what we will have to talk about later on in this lesson. But first, we're going to take a little detour and look at the writings of Marcus Aurelius.